Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, the Prime Minister dragged away from angry protesters in Canberra. Geoffrey Rush calls for more funding of the arts. And the challenges facing China. We cross to Jason Lee at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Our panel tonight, Jessica Irvine from the Sydney Morning Herald, Adam Crichton from The Australian, and John Barron from ABC News Radio. Well, in dramatic scenes outside a Canberra restaurant, the Prime Minister has been dragged away from a mob of protesters. Supporters of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy staged an angry protest outside a presentation ceremony for emergency services personnel attended by both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. Michael Anderson from the Tent Embassy says the crowd circled the restaurant in response to comments made by Tony Abbott earlier today that he thought it was time for the Tent Embassy to move on. As police escorted leaders from the restaurant, the Prime Minister stumbled, losing her footing and a shoe in the melee. John, some pretty ugly scenes there.
Certainly are, Steve, and interesting as well. The still images, the photos from the Associated Press reporter make it look in some ways worse than it was. The early reports that were coming through were sort of all over the place this afternoon on Twitter, saying that maybe the Prime Minister had been tackled by a protester and that the Secret Service had to step in. There's no doubt that the Prime Minister did stumble and was righted by a member of her security detail, but the image is perhaps going to make it look like a worse fracas than it actually was. Not to say that there weren't high emotions by all accounts from those on the scene. They were very upset at the fact that Tony Abbott, in a radio interview earlier in the day, had been asked about the 40th anniversary of the Tent Embassy, and he said that he thought that it was probably time that it was moved on. It was a bit of an eyesore. That, of course, then filtered back to those in the Tent Embassy who, on this, I suppose, most sensitive of days for Indigenous Australians, saw their emotions overflow a little bit when they found out that Tony Abbott was going to be at the restaurant. They didn't know that Julia Gillard was going to be there as well, so she was sort of an innocent bystander. Not that this is a matter of guilt, but an unfortunate incident all in all.
Jessica, what did you make of Tony Abbott's comments this morning?
Yeah, well, look, I think about this incident, the real problem is the lack of forward planning. I know both these locations in Canberra, where the tent is and where this restaurant is. They're very close. If the minders of both these leaders knew that there was going to be a gathering for the 40th anniversary of the Tent Embassy, and that's a very sensitive issue, why would you have the Prime Minister and opposition leader, gathering at an event so close in proximity? So I think it's quite an unfortunate series of events that's going to, reflect poorly on what was sort of was supposed to be a peaceful sort of gathering to commemorate the Tent Embassy. So I think this is
I'm sure there'll be a few questions asked about security, though it does seem that the person who was grabbing Julia Gillard did quite a good job of dealing with her as she was falling over. Adam, what did you make of those comments?
Yeah, just in terms of the substance of Tony Abbott's comments, I basically agree with what he said. I mean, I think after 40 years, lots of progress has been made on the land rights front, and that was one of the reasons it was established in the first place, the Tent Embassy. And also, such a vast amount of government resources are now devoted to rectifying the disadvantage that many Australian Aborigines experience. And so I just think that the ongoing protest is a little embarrassing when so much is being done.
The resources may be there, but in so many ways there hasn't been development. I mean, the original protest was about land rights, but there are other areas of disadvantage and even issues like literacy that have...
Yeah, that's certainly true, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that the increased government intervention in Aborigines' lives is actually helping them ultimately. I mean, I think the fact that they've been kind of, classified as a separate group of people has actually been very damaging to them actually over the past 40 years, and I think a lot of thinkers are now realising that maybe they should have been integrated more, but of course it's an extremely controversial issue and I don't really want to weigh into it.
Jessica, what do you think about that idea that it's time for it to move on and go somewhere else?
It's usually just sort of a couple of guys in a tent braving out the Canberra winter, and it's not actually a very large presence down there, and they have been sort of presented an option of a more formal, a more permanent sort of embassy presence, next to the portrait gallery or something. And they've actually said, no, we don't want to sort of do that because it needs to be sort of a very, present and visual reminder that there is problems for the Aboriginal community, which, whilst a minority, an important minority and often overlooked. So I sort of think it's usually not such a flashpoint, and just having a few people, their presence there is not is not hurting anyone.
John, will this protest backfire on the Aboriginal tent embassy, do you think?
Well, it certainly could. It really depends on how the media tomorrow chooses to use these images, and for the sections of the media that would perhaps be most inclined to distort them, they're in a bit of a bind here because, well, but then Julia looks like the victim in all of this, and we don't like her much either. So how are we actually going to maximise this? As for the protesters themselves, I mean, some can fairly argue, well, the Occupy movement were sort of given the bum steer from Fed Square and Martin Place a lot quicker than 40 years, so there is a double standard that applies. But
True.
I subscribe to the view that if people want to protest, then we should let them. And if they think there's still a problem that is worth demonstrating about, then by all means.